4 years ago, the first inaugural IOTA conference took place in snowy Iași in Romania. The idea of IOTA, to remind you, was born out of frustration of Orthodox scholars by the outcomes of Crete Council in 2016, which, despite its significance, has shown a weakness of pan-Orthodox process. So the idea of IOTA was based on belief that the academic community could develop new mechanisms for advancing the conciliar process and thereby helping the institutional church. And in this conference, if some of you remember, late Metropolitan Callistus Ware gave a talk which was called Synodality and Primacy in the Orthodox Church. And in this talk, he asks, what is the aim of every council? And answers, it is through the exercise of collective discernment to attain a common mind. Yet this common mind is not simply a sum of individual minds, of convictions of various participants. When gathered in council, this is a quote, we sinners become something more than what we are as isolated individuals, and this something more is exactly the presence of Christ himself, active among us through the grace of the Holy Spirit. The end of the quote. So what is synodality and what is conciliarity? These two words, let's first discuss terminology, are very close. So synodality comes from Greek, synodos, which denotes a translocal ecclesiastical assembly, and in the Latin West, they use concilium. The roots of these words are very telling. The root of the Indo-European root of concilium is can be translated as to shout, to call. So to call for something, to respond to a common call. And synodos, from the Greek synodos, with the way. So it is traveling together. So it's also, another aspect of conciliarity. And in Slavic languages, the word sabornost or sabornicity, or in Ukrainian sabornopravnost, has the root sabor, which means to gather together, to bring together, and also it means cathedral. So it's an interesting way to respond to the same concept in these three different ways. So the practice of holding councils and synods to deliberate on matters of doctrine and ministry has been at the heart of Christian church since the early Christian times. And so this was part of church identity. And therefore, the ecumenical councils are regarded as just essential part of our tradition. And despite the fact that the last council that is regarded truly ecumenical took place in 787, since then we had several not less important councils, including the Council of Constantinople in 1341, which vindicated the teaching of St. Gregory Palamas. And since then, different churches, local Orthodox churches had important councils, such as 100-head council in Russia in the 16th century, and another council in the 17th century that deposed the Patriarch Nikon with the help of Eastern patriarchs. Let's remember that. But it also condemned the so-called heresy of old believers, and 300 years later they took these anathemas from old believers, and so this decision has been reversed. So what has changed in the modern period? Let's look closer to our era, and what we see is that the arrival of modernity in the tradition-bound Orthodox world was accompanied by an ecclesial paradigm shift, an emergence of new theological consciousness, which was partly under the influence of Enlightenment and Romanticism, and it challenged some traditional understandings of conciliarity, and This change is based on the understanding of the church not as a hierarchical pyramid but more as organic community. So this is something that hasn't really been approached in the practice of conciliarity in the earlier times. So the ancient and medieval division into the teaching church and the learning church, in which the bishop is a guardian of the faith, was replaced by a new vision of the church, in which a new subject, ecclesiastical subject, emerged: the spirit-filled people of God, who were called to be active agents in the life of the church and guardians of faith and piety. And what we see is that these changes took place simultaneously in different Orthodox contexts, in the Greek world, in the Slavic world, despite the fact that some of the Orthodox churches were under the empires. So we see that the emergence of this new subject actually led the people for this liberation from the empire. So in 1848, encyclical of the Eastern Patriarch spoke explicitly about the people of God as guardians of piety and faith, thus raising the question of the representation of various groups of the church in the decision-making process. And if traditionally the councils were the councils of bishops, from the 19th century onwards, the idea, not the practice, but the idea of the greater representation within these councils became accepted as a norm. And it actually was practiced in some local contexts, for example, in the Balkan Slavic churches. So they had a tradition of Narodne Sabory, popular assemblies in which different groups of the church, including laity, were represented. In the Russian Empire, Slavophile philosophers developed a term and notion of sobornost to describe the organic unity found in the Orthodox churches, in contrast to what they perceived as the unity imposed from above of the Roman Catholic Church and the apparent lack of unity in the Protestant churches. So they emphasized the communal discernment of truth was not just an institutional dimension of the church, because the ultimate source of the truth is the Holy Spirit, and it dwells and moves precisely in the gathering of the whole ecclesiastical community, including the laity. And there was a heated debate about the practice and concept of sobornost in the 19th and early 20th century, and this debate and the process led to the first large-scale conciliar event of the modern era, the Moscow Local Church Council in 1917 and 1918, which resulted in some groundbreaking reforms within the church, which have not been implemented due to the revolution that took place in the same year. But the movement that this Sabor has generated, this Council of 1917, had influenced the theological developments within the Russian immigration that emigrated to the West, and we know that the theological schools of Paris and later of St. Vladimir's seminary have developed these ideas in various forms, and also there were different traditions that were in dialogue and obviously developed within their own theological tradition, the Greeks, Serbs, and Romanians. So we see that there are similar processes happening in different local churches. And also, as a result of the First World War and the response to this First World War, we see the ecumenical movement in Europe and America that is also based on the idea that in order to stop, Christian people killing each other, we need to have communion fellowship. We have to have instruments for Christians to be united, and therefore the whole history of ecumenical movement in the 20th century is connected with this response to violence of the war, and we come to that later. So the most widely known consequence of the ecclesial paradigm shift in Orthodoxy has been the emergence of Eucharistic ecclesiology that fused different theological findings. And according to Eucharistic ecclesiology, each Eucharistic assembly is understood as an expression of the fullness of the Church. And likewise, the understanding of Catholicity has changed in the primarily in the 20th century, and so it means not just the geographical spread of the Church throughout the world, but the manifestation of the fullness of the Church in each Eucharistic community. The notion of the unity of the Church has been also expressed in the concept of koinonia, the communion of individual believers, communities, and local churches in the image and of the communion of the persons of the Holy Trinity. And here we have to keep in mind how Trinitarian theology have become important in the discussion of conciliarity, and so there was a shift from Christology to Trinitarian theology in the 20th century. So the pursuit of conciliarity at central institutional levels, at the theological level, has been also accompanied by expressions at grassroots levels, frequently at the initiative of the laity. So we see in the 20th century various movements, lay people movements, like Russian student Christian movements, the movement of Zoe, different youth movements, and we have lay people being engaged in missionary brotherhoods, in the work of the parishes, theological institutions. Even we can see it happening in monasticism. So monasticism also is part of this conciliar. So the laity, including women, began to play a much more prominent role in the decision-making processes at parish and diocesan levels. And therefore we see that it's becoming no longer even a question whether women should not be included in these conciliar processes, and that's something which I believe is a very important for IOTA to have this larger representation of women. But now what we need what I would like to say, because there is not much time left, so why it is important today to speak and think and practice conciliarity. So there are, well, first, as I mentioned, the Council of Crete has shown that there is an increasing fragmentation and alienation in the Orthodox world, and pan-Orthodox process has become almost impossible. We see that there is a problem of diasporas, the migration of people from their traditional homelands that bring them to new environments, and so it raises the question of their jurisdictional belonging. Then there is also a problem of that is still happening, the conflicts happening in Eastern Europe as part of this, long breakup of the former communist countries that still is influencing these processes. So the war in Ukraine in particular shows that the Orthodox world is very fragile, and there is a difficulty to find mechanisms to counter this violence, to counter the support of some church hierarchs of war and violence. So in the light of the pain and conflict caused by these difficulties, we feel that we need a fresh appraisal of conciliarity and practice of conciliarity on different levels. And here I would like to mention the research project in Tartu at the University of Tartu in Estonia, which is called Orthodox, yes, Solidarity, that has an aim to study conciliarity both theologically and historically, and I believe also to engage in research activism. So in order to bring this understanding, broader to individual communities and believers. But to conclude, I think that we all need to reflect on our own position within our own contexts and how we practice conciliarity in this context. So each of us as individual members of parishes, researchers and teachers can do this, because and some people are doing it already, but perhaps maybe being more aware of the Orthodox way of doing it, being aware of that conciliarity is the heart of Orthodox identity. So we cannot simply delegate our role and our ministry as Christians to someone else, who is probably better educated or has a more institutional position within the church. So this is something I think everyone should be aware of. And as I said, so there are different ways doing it, parish assemblies, board meetings of educational institutions, meetings like IOTA and other theological gatherings. So these are different ways to practice it. And to conclude, I would like to go back to Metropolitan Callistus Ware's call that, when we practice conciliarity, so we have an opportunity to become something more, not just limited individuals in our knowledge, in our spiritual experience, but through this, through the Holy Spirit. So we can become more and grow and become better Christians. So thank you.